Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now nearing the end of our third season, but we are still just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we talk about the intersection of chemicals and toxic materials and climate change. Now, when we say or use the term climate change, the first thing that pops into your heads is probably not the impact of toxic chemicals on the environment. Some people can probably name a chemical that they've heard of that contributes to climate change, whether that be carbon dioxide or methane. But what about the many, many other chemicals that we're not familiar with that are surrounding us? So yes, chemicals do contribute directly to climate change, and that's important. But this interplay is not the only consequence of mixing chemicals and climate change. There's a lot more going on. Climate change is altering how toxic chemicals impact our health and the health of the environment. And what this means for us is that as the world warms, reducing our exposure to toxic chemicals becomes more and more important each and every day. And caring about toxic chemicals and their impact can help us minimize the impact of climate change, believe it or not. And toxic chemicals do have a very significant effect on how climate change can impact you, me, and the world. And these impacts compound as more and more chemicals are produced or used. In 1970, the United States produced 50 million tons of synthetic chemicals. And in 1995, that number tripled to about 150 million tons. And today, that number continues to just increase and increase. And very few of these tens of thousands of chemicals in our marketplace are fully tested for health hazards, and we're exposed to these chemicals in different ways, different quantities, and different mixtures. And over a lifetime, the small exposures add up every day and in varying degrees. Between climate change and toxic chemicals, it could be easy to just push that whole toxic chemical thing to the side as a someday or a later on problem and choose to tackle climate change first. And that's because you don't hear as much news about toxic chemicals as we do of necessity about climate change. But the truth is that the impacts of toxic chemicals are real, and they're happening today, and they'll only get worse in this warming world of ours. Now, these two issues are definitely connected, and they influence each other's outcomes. Climate change can have a big impact on the world, but caring about toxic chemicals can reduce the negative consequences that climate change does and will have on chemicals and consequently on all of us. Now, some of the ways that climate change and chemical pollution are interlinked are that chemical pollution can make species that are already struggling due to climate change even more vulnerable. That's animal species and us as well. Climate change can increase the impacts of chemical pollution, and climate change is amplifying the release of hazardous chemicals in the environment. And then the chemical industry is also responsible for high levels of greenhouse gas emissions in their industry and their industrial as well as their manufacturing processes. So rising temperatures, extreme weather events, melting sheets of ice, rising sea levels, All of these are proven features of climate change, and they have the potential to amplify the release and the impacts of chemical pollutants in our environment and thus on us. Now, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights recently said reducing the load of hazardous chemicals in our daily lives and the wider environment is critical to lowering the overall burden of stress to which people and wildlife are currently being exposed in these times of our climate crisis. And chemical contaminants in our environment affect humans both directly as well as indirectly. Direct toxic effects range from acute poisonings all the way to triggering acute events like heart attacks and asthma attacks, to chronic effects like cancer and suppressed immune systems. And indirect effects include changes in the health risk associated with changes in our food supply and water sources as a result of chemical contamination. And because of persistence, as well as the movement or the mobility of toxic chemicals in the environment are affected by things like weather conditions, such as temperature, our precipitation, and wind, then changes in these processes that we're seeing every day are associated with climate change, and they have implications for human exposures. And that's what we want to talk about today. And that's a lot to talk about. But here today, to help us unpack this and explore some of this, are three experts and on-the-ground people with all of this. We have with us Darya Minovi. And Darya is a public health advocate, and she's passionate about environmental justice and the use of research to inform policymaking. Darya previously served as a senior policy analyst at the Center for Progressive Reform, where she assessed the impacts of unregulated pollution on communities, particularly in the face of the worsening climate crisis. Darya has a master's of public health in environmental health at Harvard University. Welcome, Darya. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, and the public health degree was correct.
Thank you so much for carving out time to be with us. Our next guest is Jacob Carter. Jacob is the research director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And they are very good friends of our show in that they're on with us each of our seasons, hopefully more than one time. We try anyway. Dr. Carter investigates how science is used in the policymaking process, and he focuses on issues of scientific integrity across the federal government. Prior to joining the Union of Concerned Scientists, Jacob worked at the Environmental Protection Agency at Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education as a postdoctoral fellow. And at the EPA, he integrated the effects of climate change into estimates of future coastal inundation on contaminated land, such as brownfields and Superfund sites. And he did that work in order to help guide decisions on adaptation efforts that could better protect nearby communities from the spread of dangerous contaminants during future floods, like what we experienced here in Texas, in Houston, not too long ago with Harvey. Welcome, Jacob. Did I get all of that right?
That's all right. Thanks for having me, Bernice.
And thank you for making time to be with us today. And our other guest is Lynn Lafferty. Lynn is a pharmacist. She's a naturopathic doctor, a diplomat of the American Clinical Board of Nutrition. She is a master herbalist, and she is an endowed professor and assistant clinical professor at Nova Southeastern University College of Pharmacy there in Fort Lauderdale. And Lynn has a functional clinical nutrition and herbal therapy practice at Nova in their clinic pharmacy. And her research is focused on natural medicine and supplementation therapy. And she's currently conducting research on antibiotic resistance and natural immune builders. Welcome, Lynn. Did I get all of that right?
Yes. And I'm a former board member of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine.
Indeed. That's where we first met Lynn, and she was one of our early guests. And they do some amazing work, and that really does help to inform her work there at Nova by connecting that with the environmental factors. So again, all three of you all, we really appreciate you being with us and taking time for us today. Now, I want to start my questioning off with Darya, and this will just be for a minute because we only have a minute to go before we go to break, but we'll reconnect with you on the other side, Darya. But so, Darya, you have expertise in public health and environmental health. Can you discuss for our listeners what this means? How is public health affected by environmental health? And then we'll talk about the other on the other side of the break.
Absolutely. So environmental health is a key aspect of public health because it's looking at how our environment impacts our health and considering how exposure to various agents through inhalation, through consumption, through touch or other contact can impact populations. And toxic chemicals are a core aspect of environmental health, particularly today as we're learning about how ubiquitous certain chemicals are in our everyday life. Take PFAS, for example, which are a class of chemicals often called forever chemicals because of how persistent they are in our environment. And lately, it feels like almost every day we're seeing a new study about finding these chemicals in our water, in our household products, in our cookware, like Teflon. So environmental health is something we can't escape because it impacts our everyday life.
Indeed. And we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to start out of the chute, trying to give our listeners an understanding of the growing importance and maybe urgency to some degree of environmental health, and certainly the interconnectedness of environment and health, which of course is what Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio is about. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with our guest, Darya Minovi, Jacob Carter, and Lynn Lafferty. Thank you all for being with us. We'll be right back. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body and non-mercury. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the intersection of chemicals and toxic materials and climate change. And we are back with some very special guests who are helping us unpack this and really understand this a lot more. We are back with Darya Minovi, who is a public health advocate in environmental health. We're back with Jacob Carter with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we're back with Dr. Lynn Lafferty, practicing pharmacist and clinical pharmacist, as well as naturopath and nutrition expert and herbalist. So we've got some really well-rounded expertise to really help us understand what is not an uncomplex area. Now, before the break, Darya was explaining to us the importance really of environmental health in public health. And so, Darya, I want you to continue to talk to us, though, more about how public health is affected by environmental health and where do chemicals and toxic materials and their intersection with climate change intersect with environmental health.
Absolutely. So any one of us can be exposed to chemicals in our everyday life, whether it's the plastic packaging that's around your vegetables that you're going to cook for dinner, in the nail polish that you put on, in the cookware that you're using. And so environmental health is something that we deal with on a daily basis because the chemicals that exist in our environment, whether it's in our homes or in our communities, can impact us. And one thing that we like to talk about in this field is the idea of cumulative effects, where one exposure might not have an adverse impact on your health, but small amounts of different exposures over time can impact your health, particularly if you have other sensitivities and other health concerns. So with environmental health, within the public health space, we're looking at trying to eliminate and decrease these exposures and hazards on a grand scale to ensure that folks can have a better chance of overcoming these exposures and not having adverse health effects down the line. And where climate change comes into play is that particularly in the role it might have in increasing our exposure to toxic chemicals, particularly during extreme weather events. So say you're living in a coastal community that's prone to hurricanes and flooding, and there is a severe flood like we saw during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And the storm surge or flooding can cause chemicals that are in the soil. If there are spills, chemical spills at industrial facilities or explosions, all of that sort of can become sort of a toxic soup that people can be exposed to through contact with floodwaters, inhaling gases that are emitted. So it's a really significant concern, particularly when you've got extreme weather.
Thank you. And I want to jump over to Lynn for her to drill down a bit on some of the public health things that you mentioned to individual health. But before I do that, I want to go to Jacob to tell us more about some of these chemicals that we're exposed to. Jacob, what would you say, or what do you see out there as the most prevalent chemicals in our world today that are causing, driving, or otherwise affecting climate change, and how so?
Yeah, well, I think, what Darya was pointing to in terms of chemicals that are essentially housed by various facilities and are at risk by extreme weather are a particular concern. So, for example, Darya mentioned Hurricane Harvey, and we know that impacted a Superfund site, which is a site that houses some of the most dangerous chemicals known to humankind, was impacted by Hurricane Harvey.
What's the name of that site? What's the name of that site?
The San Jacinto Waste Pit is the name of the Superfund site. Okay. And it was actually breached, and it released chemicals known as dioxins. And dioxins are one of those chemicals that if you're exposed to them, they are known to cause cancer. So those are, particular chemicals that you do not want to be around. I mean, some of these other sites that are at risk of extreme weather include volatile organic compounds, polychlorinated biphenyls. And if you go to the EPA's public information page, you can read all about how these chemicals affect human health. Most of them are probable cancer-causing agents. The polychlorinated biphenyls that I mentioned can affect your immune system. They can affect your reproductive system, your nervous system, your endocrine system.
I'm sorry, Jacob, where do those polybiphenyls you were describing, what are they? What do they come from? How do we help us better understand?
They're usually a product of industry, so they're usually industrial waste. So, for example, those dioxins that I mentioned that were leaked out of the San Jacinto waste tent were waste that came from a former paper mill.
So areas that are around a lot of current or perhaps even legacy or shut down industrial facilities are really, really at risk.
They are, especially when they're on coastal communities. So something that my group has studied a lot is how sea level rise is factoring into these extreme events. Because as you might imagine, around coastal communities, if you have these hazardous facilities that are located around the coast and you have sea levels that are rising, the floods that used to occur in those areas are going to be even more extreme because the water is just higher. And so that presents a definite vulnerability to these hazardous facilities because if floods are going to increase, that means what they were built to withstand in the past to resist sort of these flood heights, they're going to need to be adapted to withstand even higher flood heights in the future.
Indeed, and we're just having floods everywhere, even in places that may not be historically flood prone. And then there's the other issue. It's like 1 year it's a flood, the big weather, the big extreme weather incidences are floods. So next year they become tornadoes. Next year they could be hurricanes, or some years we have all of them and then add to fires. So we've got a lot to deal with. And later on, though, in the show before we go, I definitely want to address how are we dealing with the futures that we know are in our near future? Because we know that weather events are getting more extreme. So we know we're going to have these extreme things. So what are we doing, or how are we dealing with the impact on communities and the environmental health threats that we know are coming? So, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I want to get now, though, to Lynn, because I want to talk about, again, drilling down in terms of, I guess, personal health, the impacts of of toxic chemicals and manifestation. In other words, what are the health impacts or manifestations of toxic chemicals and materials that you see on individual health in your practice and your research?
Well, I think for me, I'm in my early 60s, and I'm around my students who are in their 20s. The level of illness in the young is just overwhelming to me. I have to tell the students, when I was your age, no one was obese when they were little. There wasn't these autoimmune diseases. No one had type 2 diabetes, yet probably about 1 million, below 20 have it today. So it just goes on. And one of the things that concerns me is all of the waste from the use or the dumping of pharmaceuticals in our water and that effect that it has. One of the things I see, because I'm seeing so many young people with rheumatoid arthritis and MS and all these things that were unheard of in someone's 20s or 30s. The one thing they all seem to have in common, which would be maybe a partner with the public health person here, is they all took multiple antibiotics when they were children, which kills your good gut flora. And what happens is 80% of your immune system is in your GI tract. So it opens you up to all sorts of, infections and autoimmune conditions and that type of thing. And there's, looking at the studies, there's many antibiotics also that show up in our water. Fortunately, a lot of the farmers have gotten it out of the animals. I was very excited because there's a lot of really good research on oregano oil now. And because the pig farmers are feeding that to their animals in lieu of feeding the antibiotics to them, which we know causes antibiotic resistance. And before COVID, people were saying, the WHO was saying that was the number one health crisis in the world, was antibiotic resistance.
That is heartening that farmers have become attuned to some of the natural health remedies, which tend to be natural and not toxic. So that's exciting.
And I was concerned that maybe there'd be resistance with oregano oil because it's very powerful antimicrobial. But there's not. As a matter of fact, it actually, in the studies they showed with the pigs, which is the closest genetically to a human, is they showed that it actually helps repair the GI tract and kill some of the bad microbes. So that was good. And then also, it's funny, a lot of us that are in the Academy of Environmental Medicine, the doctors, we have environmental issues ourselves. So I have a SNP, as they call it, with some of the detoxifications that need to take place with myself. And so the liver and the detoxification process becomes very important.
Indeed. I hate to stop you, but we've got to go to break. But we'll be back with you on the other side talking about some of the health components and interconnected activities as it relates to the toxins in our environment. Thank you. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show on the intersection of chemicals and toxic materials and climate change. And we are back with Darya Minovi, who is a public health advocate and has expertise in environmental health as it relates to public health. We have with us Dr. Jacob Carter, who's with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Dr. Lynn Lafferty, a practicing pharmacist and naturopath at Nova Southwestern University. Again, thank you all for being with us. And before the break, though, we were with Lynn, who was telling us about some of the health impacts and some of the research she had looked at in terms of the manifestations of toxic chemicals and materials on individual health. And so what I want to ask you, Lynn, is there something that's shouting out at your profession, particularly the naturopathic, natural medicine, and holistic and integrative professionals? Is there something that's shouting out at them in recent years of an issue that they may be seeing that either is clearly or perhaps suspected to be from an environmental health cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many things. It's unbelievable because these plastics also from water bottles and things, especially if any plastic's exposed to light, the nanoparticles are very difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of. And all sorts of chemicals. I know there's one man won a lawsuit who worked around pesticides because of his cancer. You know, toxins like to hide in fat. So fatty tissues like your brain, nervous system, all of those things are going to be affected if you're not able to detoxify those chemicals out of the body. But, you know, a lot of information now, the gut-brain connection everybody hears. The gut is so important, especially to our immune system. And, you know, interesting how maybe we didn't understand how come some people may have passed from COVID and then others didn't when they were young, you know, a young person. Why did this happen? And we don't really look at the environmental impact of their ability not to be able to detoxify and having poor diets, or if they have a poor GI system, the nutrients they need didn't get absorbed. I mean, I can go on and on. There's so many issues when it comes to the environment. And unfortunately, it's not something that most doctors learn about. I had a young woman who was a student, and she came in dragging, and I said, you know, is something wrong? She said, Dr. Lafferty, I've been to 25 hospitals, and I have been on oxycodone since I was 12 years old. And I'm like, wow. And she said, I'm so sick. I've got pain. Nobody could ever figure out why. So I said, we had an appointment. And I said, well, what does your father do? She's a UPS driver. I said, really? I could swear you were around farm chemicals. I asked people, do you live in a farm area or whatever? And she said, oh, well, we've had a landscaping business and I held my father since I was 2 years old. I mean, so she had all those chemical exposures. And she said, well, why does my brother not have this? Well, we're each individuals. You're not able to detoxify like your brother. Plus, women have a lot more fat in their body, and those chemicals are fat soluble, and they stay in the fat.
I want to sit for just a minute on detoxification and detox. I think that's so important and relevant. And from what I've seen, people may not take it as seriously as it should be or realize its impact. It's simply detox is getting toxins out. And a lot of the toxins that you're getting out are some of these things we've been talking about and that we're going to talk about in a minute. And that's what I wanted to bring together, because you see on the shelf, oh, detox this. And so I think maybe it's the whole process, the term, and its significance to people is way underestimated. So it's really a process of getting some of these toxic chemicals out of your body, because as you mentioned, and we still don't know the full effect of how they can build up within us.
That's correct.
I want to go now to Jacob and talk a little bit, though, about how things have been trending over the years in terms of more and more toxic chemicals coming into our environment. But at the same time, we know more about them and have the ability anyway to mitigate if we will. So how are we trending? Things getting better or worse? Are there more or less toxic chemicals and materials now affecting the environment? and affecting climate change than 20 years ago or less?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that the risk of climate-related disasters at toxic facilities and the potential release of those toxic contaminants is getting worse and worse. So this is now the 7th consecutive season that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has said we are going to have an above-average hurricane season in the Atlantic. And that means there's going to be more risk for coastal flooding, more risk for dangerous winds to potentially lead to some sort of catastrophic situation where contaminants are released into nearby communities. And it's not just hurricanes, right? It's wildfires, it's extreme heat, it's all of the climate change effects, which all present these increased risks. Most of the folks that are going to be affected by these releases are communities of color, low-income communities, most underserved communities, right? So not everybody is equally affected across the United States.
Well, not yet, and in some components, and want to talk about that a little bit later, too. But what I'm wondering, they know it's the Atlantic hurricane season, and I've lived in Miami for a number of years, so I know how that affects them. So we know it's coming. Are we preparing, or is maybe the federal government or the EPA sending out notices that during this hurricane season that's going to be particularly overactive, you need to lock down and do something to mitigate ABC Superfund site, DEF potential site? Because the sites are known, the weather is known.
Yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done, unfortunately. And a lot of that was sort of delayed, and a lot of good policy was unfortunately rescinded on climate change by the prior administration. So that work is now having to be picked back up and rethought. But, I think the Environmental Protection Agency, in particular, who oversees a lot of the hazardous facility management, and is responsible for incorporating climate change into plans, hasn't really got there yet. So it's not even required that the Superfund sites, when they go through their cleanup plans, have to consider climate change. You see it in some of the cleanup plans, but that is done on sort of a case-by-case basis. But we have no federal policy that mandates that these facilities have to incorporate climate change.
And that's also, it makes all of us here, as well as hopefully our audience too, realize the benefit of a lot of the advocates who work in the community, because it's the community who's going to be affected. And if there's not legislators and laws that are going to help them, they too need to realize and understand, which we hope conversations like this are beneficial to that end, but they need to understand that there's a possibility for that Superfund site or other site that's dangerous, that's down the road from them, maybe 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 miles, that with this hurricane coming up or this tornado coming up or flood, that there's the opportunity, the great opportunity, for that to flood and contaminate everything about and around them.
That's absolutely correct. And I think it's also important for any scientists on the call listening to understand that as well, and to, hop on and help out these communities who are already overburdened, and really could use the help of researchers and scientists. So if you are a scientist listening, definitely learn how to work within your community and help them out.
And we've just got a couple of minutes to go before we go on break, and I want to continue this conversation and have more conversation before our time is done about how many, at least environmental issues, are beginning to spread out from those vulnerable communities. And the vulnerable communities remain the most ill-prepared or least prepared to deal with it. But nevertheless, the effects of the issues are beginning to spread out. So I appreciate y'all with us. We're going to go to break now, and we will be back for more of this stimulating conversation. We have been with Darya Minovi, a public health, environmental health advocate, Jacob Carter with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Dr. Lynn Lafferty with Nova Southwestern University. We'll be right back on the other side of the break. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the intersection of toxic chemicals and hazardous waste with climate change, and all of it is affecting us. And we are back with three very smart people who are lending us some of that smart in terms of the very pervasive impact that the toxic chemicals and materials in our environment all around us have on us and our health. So again, thank you all for being with us. Now, before we went on break, Jacob was telling us about trends, but one of the things I'm dying to ask, Jacob, is this. We talked about, or at least we mentioned, how that the chemicals build up in our bodies over years and affect our health negatively. So can we talk about the buildup of the chemicals in the environment, or do they build up, or do they dissipate, or how does that all work?
They definitely can build up, and I think Darya had mentioned this earlier. One thing that we're really concerned about in multiple of these underserved communities is the cumulative impact of these chemicals. So over many, many years, what has happened is industry has sort of built up multiple facilities in the same location, and which contain multiple different chemicals that are known to be hazardous to human health, or produce air pollutants that are hazardous to human health. So Cancer Alley is probably the most well-known example in Louisiana, where folks there are who live near or in this area are at heightened risk of cancer, heart attack, asthma, other health effects. So that way, I wouldn't say they build up sort of over time in the environment, but you can have multiple different chemicals that have multiple health effects. And we really don't fully understand how those cumulative impacts sort of all work together to impact somebody's health.
And it's really scary, too, that we don't know that we have gotten rid of them when we think we have, and we don't know if they can ever be gotten rid of. But there are some examples, like I remember Atlantic Station, which was this big rail switching yard, and with a lot of steel effects there. And they were able to, it took a long time and it took gobs of money, but they were able to, I guess, clean it up enough that it is now one of the hot spots in Atlanta, where it's mixed use, residential, many different types of residential, as well as shopping. But I imagine that's a big undertaking.
Absolutely. And some of these sites, like some of the Superfund sites that I've been talking about on this call, they can take literally decades to get cleaned up, get to a point where they are no longer considered dangerous to human health. But even then, what we're finding is that there can be some residual chemicals left in the soil that can result in sort of volatilization, so gaseous compounds coming up later that can still impact human health. And so, yeah, it is a hard and long process that costs a lot of money.
For which there's still a lot of unknowns. And the other thing I want to have you talk to us about, Jacob, is to kind of flip the switch. We've been talking a lot about how the environmental toxins and materials impact the environment and climate. So I want to talk a minute about how is climate change and or environmental factors affecting the toxicity of chemicals or affecting chemicals at all?
Well, I think like what we've been talking about, these environmental effects, especially of climate change, can end up washing chemicals into people's backyards that weren't there before. There may be chemicals in groundwater where sea level rise intrusion into that groundwater leads to chemicals being introduced into a higher soil profile than we hadn't had before. So you may have areas that become affected with toxic chemicals, become contaminated that weren't contaminated before.
Indeed. Are we seeing any incidences of the chemicals themselves becoming more dangerous, more toxic? Are we seeing climate change have an effect on the chemicals themselves?
Not to my knowledge. You can certainly have wildfires that come through facilities with hazardous chemicals, and then they produce a gaseous compound that spread, and the chemical can change in that way and sort of reach a larger area and put more people at risk. But in terms of making chemicals more toxic, I'm just not aware of any research showing that.
Okay, I want to let Darya weigh in on that one for a minute.
Yeah, just to add, like Jacob said, I'm also not aware of climate change, making certain chemicals more toxic. But one thing to also consider is, when there are chemical disasters, that chemicals can mix together and form an impact that is more dangerous than if you were exposed to those chemicals individually. We call that synergistic effects. So the way in which those chemicals interact can actually cause them to be more harmful to you if you're exposed to them, particularly during a disaster situation.
And then, Lynn, we want to go to you. You want to weigh in on that?
Yes. One study showed that in the winter months, there was more toxic drugs in the drinking water because it was colder. I believe the study was done in Missouri, and it was because the warmer weather speeds up the enzymes and the process to break down those chemicals.
Now, Lynn, are there any statistics out there, or what are you seeing about the impact of these chemical toxins and environmental toxins on our immune systems? I know you talked about it a little bit, but I want to really focus in on that because that seems to be such a prevalent thing these days.
We have one of the largest researchers on our university that I partner with. They look at Gulf War syndrome and also chronic fatigue syndrome. And absolutely, their immune systems are decimated by toxins and also from viruses and things. So certain things, like, for instance, when you have a heavy metal toxicity, mold seems to and fungus seem to like to grow in that more environment. So we see all sorts of different implications of what the pollution is doing that's in our environment to the body. And like I said, to see so many young people with all these autoimmune conditions, it's frightening to me because I remember in 1982, when I was just a young pharmacist, I had 2 patients with type 2 diabetes, and they were in their 70s. And now there's so many people in their 20s and 30s with that on medications, and it's really mind-blowing to me.
Do you know, or any of you all know of any research that's being done, though, on the higher incidence of autoimmune issues as well as other diseases and illnesses among young people today? And it seems to me it is probably a normal manifestation because they were exposed to many, 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 many more chemicals and other stuff at their age, at the respective ages than perhaps others were. Because it goes back to how we talked about how many chemicals were being produced and things like that. I guess it also addresses why they are and should continue to be so active in environmental advocacy because they're catching the brunt of it.
One big chemical that's been a concern in terms of immune response is the PFAS chemicals, which we call forever chemicals. There was some evidence showing that it might impact your body's ability to respond to a vaccine, which was, of course, of concern with the COVID pandemic and the vaccines that we have access to. So there are certain chemicals that can sort of inhibit your body's ability to sort of mount an immune response to a virus.
Indeed. And we only have a couple of minutes to go. So I'm going to jump back to Lynn real quick and then go around. Lynn, from your perspective, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions to these issues and protect themselves?
Well, one of the things we recommend is I say go get some glass water bottles, or, I say there's one grocery store that they have sparkling water in glass, and recycle it. Get yourself a good system to invest in a good system, which more and more of my patients are, of water filtration at the side of their house, spending a lot of money for water filtration systems. Also, not cooking in plastics or warming plastics. Like I said, they found when plastic water bottles got warm, the nanoparticles of plastic were there. And then also the detoxification. So anytime you're eating organic, because organic, you're not got chemicals on them, or they shouldn't, any fruits and vegetables, those things give you the vitamins and other nutrients to detoxify.
Indeed. Thank you, Lynn. And Darya, last word. What can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
Yeah, so one thing that folks can do is, specifically with individual chemical exposures, is look into resources that advocates have done the heavy lifting on the research about specific chemicals and provided it in a way that's easily understandable. So the Environmental Working Group in particular has a ton of resources, including a great app called Skin Deep that you can use and look at different cosmetic or personal care products and see how they might impact your health. And they have, with various food products and others. So definitely check them out. It's a great and easy to use resource.
Thank you. Thank you. And Jacob, we want to thank you for being with us. Darya, we want to thank you for being with us. And Lynn, thank you. And we are looking forward to talking with you all much more on Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio in the future, because the whole area we didn't get to talk about, I wanted to touch upon, and that was the chemicals in our cosmetics. There's a lot out there. Thank you. And we thank these wonderful people for helping us explore this a little bit today. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in our home, in your social circles, workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you again, and join us again next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio as we begin to look at food production and agriculture and its effect on our health and how our health proceeds. Thank you.